Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another mini Beyond Terrain lecture. If you're new around here, make sure you subscribe. If you like the content, you leave us a like and a comment. Make sure to share with a friend. Today, the topic of discussion is psychological trauma. There's been a lot of discussion in the following weeks after the episode with Mr. Roitas, where we discussed emotional trauma and its role in the cause of illness. Now, I feel like there's been a lot of confusion surrounding this topic now, especially in our circle here. It almost feels a little dogmatic the way that psychological trauma has been discussed in relation to disease. So I think this is sort of a refreshing little challenge to the terrain community to keep us in line and to ensure that we're not entertaining any sort of dogmatic beliefs that are founded on nothing in reality at all. But of course, the terrain community always welcomes these discussions with open arms, which I appreciate so much. First point I want to make is what causes trauma? What is a trauma? Because trauma is kind of like a buzzword nowadays. There's no doubt about it. It's used in many circles, even in the psychology circles, psychotherapy circles that I'm in the more academic circles. So getting a good definition of trauma is certainly important. And this is something that we'll likely have to work on moving forward. I think in our discussion of trauma, I think we can certainly tie it into this idea of a toxicity or deficiency. There can be toxic events that we experience, such as, any sort of excess. So any sort of excessive physical contact might be abuse. Again, unnatural things in any quantity is an excess, right? So anything that we experience that's, not natural is going to be a psychological trauma. So saying things like experiencing social media, a hyper form of being social and the standards that are given to especially young women, probably for you men as well. I think that grouped into this idea of trauma is the deficiency side of things. You could certainly be deficient in love. You could be deficient in nurture. Deficient in physical touch, deficient in connection. I think that these are all things that are at the root of psychological traumas. Growing up in these environments, nowadays it's very apparent that many parents do not want their children, or they do not want to be around them. That's why the school systems are designed the way that they are, and parents get upset now when there's a snow day, because of course they do not want to be around their children. We saw this during, the whole fiasco of COVID. Parents were going crazy because they had to spend so much time with their kids. Really an absurd thing. Really an unnatural thing because, in the tribal setting, I think that children were praised. If somebody had children, they were full of potential, full of life, full of energy, full of vitality to be shaped into, what the tribe needed. They were treated fully with acceptance, open arms. They were loved, they were cared for. There were so many hands on deck as well. When they say it takes a village, it truly does. So I think an important point to make regarding psychological traumas is that, again, it's not really what happens to you, but it's how it's interpreted, how it's perceived, how it's internalized. And this is going to be different for every single person out there. And this is exactly why I think that psychology is not an empirical field. I don't think that these things can be studied empirically whatsoever, as showcased by the field of psychology. Obviously, much of the great work is not empirical whatsoever, and any claims to provide empirical data on psychological phenomenon just fails and is irreproducible. So, when I am talking with clients, especially from the psychological standpoint, it's very interesting what sort of patterns arise in taking a history of individuals, right? Their experiences. People experience such different things, and it certainly seems to be the case that the weight of these events is correlated to the weight of the symptoms. If we are going to make a case for psychological factors causing illness, being left alone in a room for 10 minutes when you're a kid, say in ages 0 to 5, is not going to cause any sort of chronic kidney illness or real bad degenerative diseases. I think that, the higher ACE scores, right, the higher adverse reactions are what are causing these really bad illnesses, if we're going to make a case for psychological traumas causing illness. You tend to see that there's a lot of, abuse and sexual abuse and, a real deficiency in love and care. Kids that are growing up without food and water. But again, I think there's probably a better way to discuss this, because you may grow up in third world country without access to clothing or great shelter, or you may be hungry sometimes, but the children are cared for at greater rates. They're cared for, they're taken care of, and they're loved and they're welcomed for the most part. It's very hard to speak in absolutes when it comes to the psychological realm, which makes this discussion a little bit more difficult to have. I want to make a few points about natural versus unnatural trauma as well. And again, this might circle back into how things are perceived. And it likely depends on what is being told to us as we grow up. A natural trauma would be stuff like loss, right? Or experiencing, some sort of violence. Even if it is human on human violence. I think the natural forms of this is like war, hunting, things of that nature. That's what children would observe in the natural setting. When it comes to things that are unnatural, could be violence in the household. Mom and dad fighting or abusing each other, stuff like that, I think would be certainly more unnatural. I don't think that that's something that happens naturally in the tribal setting, especially. I think another form of unnatural trauma would be a lack of love. I think a form of unnatural trauma would be a feeling of being unwanted, right? Your parents not wanting you. In nature, the goal is to try to reproduce as much as you possibly can, so every child and baby is welcomed greatly. In the modern age, many people don't want children and might have one by accident, and if they pursue that child and they don't like that child, they don't want that child, that's going to manifest in their actions towards that child. They're going to try and, get away from them and, put them in daycare, after school program, school in general, right? Grade school. Not to say that, everybody that experiences these things is going to have this trauma, because I think the intention matters as well, right? That this underlying energy that is sort of unspoken. I think that's really, really important, because a lot of parents put their kids in after school programs and school and, daycare, but for good reasons, because they feel like they need to work and make money to be able to provide for their kids. And, they're so extremely happy to pick them up. They're sad dropping them off, happy to pick them up. And I think that's a really important distinction, right? So it's not as easy as just saying this event is going to be traumatic. There's an intention that matters behind everything. And this intention is very important. I do think that it's important, the perspective, and it shapes the worldview of the individual who's being traumatized, for lack of better terms. On the topic of, natives experiencing trauma, they certainly did, right? They certainly experienced these natural forms of trauma, violence, maybe even starvation at some points, deficiencies. They probably had deficiencies in food and shelter and, living conditions, stuff like that. But it's not as though the entire tribe was always trying to better themselves, always trying to improve their situation. And it's not as though children suffered and other people in the tribe, were thriving. It was often a communal experience, right? There were people in this tribe, all of them were struggling at the same time. Everyone was struggling, everyone was starving. Everyone was in a rainstorm or a snowstorm. The point I want to add to the discussion with the natives especially is that perhaps these unnatural traumas could still trigger some sort of event. in individuals. Maybe it was purely psychologically. But say that, a child lost their father when they were very young due to hunting. That child might develop a need to become the best hunter possible and could never hang up the bow. And, when they're 30 years old, they die because a bear gets them. You know what I mean? Maybe that's a natural method, before our cushy modern worlds of going to the supermarket. We don't die from hunting anymore, nearly at the rates as we used to. Still happens outside of first world countries, but perhaps that was the way nature cycled this, right? Maybe that's the way that it was manifest in these natural settings. So maybe natives did experience more trauma, and maybe it's true that they did die younger due to this, right? They just died in different ways, right? Nature manifested in different ways at that time. It's an interesting thing to think about. It's like, what kind of evidence are we seeking here? What kind of evidence can we have outside of the, logical point of view? The next point that I want to make is the discussion with the Bigglesons. I want to bring this into the picture. Their understanding was very interesting, that there was a complex interplay between our experiences and our traumas and the toxins, right? They said that, for our bodies to be able to hold on to toxins, there had to be some sort of underlying emotional trauma. Again, an interesting idea. I think Daniel makes a great point that, again, you can't blame the trauma if without the toxins that disease wouldn't be manifest. I think the point that I'm trying to make is that perhaps that dis-ease, that illness would be manifest in any respect. Maybe it was just in a different way, such as a physical trauma, right? Physical traumas might have followed psychological traumas, but now, since we don't face that same environment, though our psychological traumas manifest as these physical illnesses, such as holding on to toxicities, becoming chronic illnesses, chronic pains, etc., etc. That would be my argument for psychological traumas being at a root cause more so. And it's certainly the case that natives didn't have the toxins that we have today, and they didn't have these extreme diseases that we have today, right? So if we boil it down, the toxins are at the absolute root. Toxicities and deficiencies, straight up physical toxicities and deficiencies, are at the root. And we can ignore our traumas. Again, I don't necessarily think this was the point of the podcast with Mr. DeRoitas, not to speak for him, but I don't think that he was saying to ignore it. I think the point was that we shouldn't get burdened by this dogmatic way of thinking that psychological trauma is the root cause of every single illness out there. So, from my perspective at this point, what do I think trauma causes, right? We experience a trauma, a traumatic event, a traumatic experience. We respond in a certain way when we're a child. What happens to that individual that experiences these things? So I do think that our experiences shape us as individuals, especially psychologically. I do think that we are adaptive in nature as well. I do think that we adapt to our environment. Now, in the German New Medicine perspective, we would say that psychological adaptations also are followed by biological adaptations, which is kind of the basis of their argument. But what I'm certain about is that psychological adaptations arise from experiences that we interpret. I do think that we can develop maladaptive complexes based on the experience that we experience. Say something like attachment styles. I think that if you grow up experiencing a certain type of attachment style, that you're going to continue to seek out that attachment style moving forward. It's like the same reason why people seek out, abusive relationships when they grew up being abused. Like if you grow up and you're babied constantly and, your mother's catering to you and maybe she's overbearing and, overprotects you, right? I think that that's going to shape you as an individual. You might be a little softer. You might be a little more adverse to, adversity. You might not be able to handle stressful situations. You might not be able to handle, conflicts, things like that. Things if you're sheltered from, you're not going to be able to respond to it, right? And so this maladaptive area is that, you might have needed to adapt that way in the past, right? Or you had an event that, really caused you a lot of stress and you responded in a certain way. But then you continue to respond in the same way moving forward, no matter what happens, because you've internalized this experience. It's shaped your worldview. It's shaped your understanding of the world. You think people have bad intentions always. Stuff like this is where the maladaptive piece comes in. So I do think that traumatic events might contribute to this. And I think there are ways to, heal from these traumatic events and to be able to respond better moving forward, to remain adaptive, right? To be able to remain loose and, really shape yourself to every single situation in the best manner possible, not necessarily just based on what you've experienced in the past, because especially if it was traumatic, this might be ingrained in your way of thinking, and your responses might not be the best. Say you grew up and you weren't allowed to display sadness, but you were allowed to display anger. You might constantly respond to being sad by getting angry. You might not be able to show your emotions of sadness. You might not be able to cry. You might not be able to do these things based on that adaptation you had to do. You had to learn how to get your emotions out, right? You had to learn a way to partly process your emotions, but you couldn't show your true emotions, right? So this is what caused this maladaptive adaptation, right? I think another thing that can happen is that you can internalize and develop self-beliefs based on the events that happen to you. Things like, I'm not good enough, I'm incapable, I'm unlovable, stuff like that. You might have developed these based on the experiences that you've encountered in your life, right? And these might be ingrained inside of you. I mean, you might truly believe that, you aren't good enough. You might truly believe that you are incapable of doing things that you're very capable of doing, right? Everyone's good enough. Everyone's lovable. Everyone's capable in some respect, But again, these ideas become maladapted, right? So maybe you were incapable in one area of your life, but now that translates to every area of your life. It's not really fair to you as the individual. You could see why this can't be spoken of empirically, right? Because it's very individual, right? These examples can be shaped and, changed in very subtle ways that, have drastic effects, right? Again, it's also the way that it's internalized. I've encountered people who've encountered very similar situations, but they've internalized a completely different self-belief, right? They have completely different beliefs about themselves and the world around them based off similar events. But again, details matter in this respect, right? It's very subtle. And I'll tell you what, the people that I am encountering in my practice of psychotherapy, these individuals aren't experiencing, natural forms of traumas. These people are experiencing very, very unnatural forms of trauma, so I think that's another really important thing. The other thing is that largely individuals don't have support anymore. People are not supported by their families and their communities. They don't have people to talk to. That's why the whole field of psychotherapy exists nowadays, because people don't have safe spaces. They don't have objective, non-judgmental people to talk to. So, not to make any blanket statements, but it certainly seems that, psychological illnesses can come from purely psychological events, especially the extreme ones, like the psychosis, schizophrenia, bipolar, stuff like that, borderline personality. I mean, these are also, very subjective, and diagnosis in general is just garbage. The DSM is the worst thing that's ever been invented, especially the DSM-5. But nevertheless, people in mental states that are undesirable, I think it can be caused purely by psychological phenomenon. Not to say that, diet and toxicity might not play a role, but I think it's also important to ask the question of, is this really all black and white? Can we have this nuanced interaction between our traumas, our psychological interpretations, perspectives, sort of that psychological realm, and the physical realm? I certainly think that there is an interplay here in some respect, and I think trying to figure that out is the more difficult part of it. I think this is a really important time for the terrain community. I think this is something that really should be evaluated. I'm not completely against the idea that, some sort of psychological trauma causes some sort of weakness in the body. That's been talked about for a very long time. Traditional Chinese medicine, anger in the liver and grief in the lungs, stuff like that has been talked about for a very long time. Perhaps there is some sort of physical weakness that is caused by psychological traumas. But again, these really drastic, harmful, chronic illnesses were not around in the native times. And perhaps that's because of this interplay of toxicity. Perhaps they only had the natural toxicities, the natural physical toxicities in their body, which didn't affect them at such a rate. Maybe their biological manifestations were just, acute. But they were dealt with. These psychological traumas were also dealt with. There was a strong sense of community, support. People were living a natural life. They were moving. They were sleeping properly. They were grounding. They were connected to their food sources. They were also having to be exposed to the traumas that they experienced. If they lost someone, they were continuously exposed to loss. Loss was a very common thing. If they lost someone hunting, they would have to go hunting or you would die. So, you had to be exposed to these things. You couldn't just curl up and, never experience reality, right? Or you weren't disassociating using drugs and alcohol. That's another really common thing among individuals with these chronic illnesses. Now a lot of pot smoking is happening and you're disassociating from reality completely, right? So that's another really important thing. Maybe it's that we just completely disassociate from our experience and we disassociate from our traumas and what happens to us in our experiences. And maybe that we're avoiding the symptoms. We don't want to feel sad. We don't want to feel angry. We don't want to deal with it. We put it off and then we smoke some pot or drink alcohol and, forget about it, and push it down and suppress it. To conclude, I just hope, that this kind of cleared some things up. I know that there's still a lot of questions that need to be explored more in depth, and we'll continue to explore them. I kind of wanted to just get some of these questions in an area where I could go back and review it. So that was half the purpose of this video. I'm really eager to hear you guys' comments on this. I really enjoyed reading your comments on the Reuters podcast. If you haven't listened to it, make sure you go listen to it. It was a phenomenal episode. I don't think that the purpose of that episode was to completely negate the psychological either. I think that would be another reductionism, right? That we'd be more engaged in a materialistic mindset. Perhaps not. Perhaps there's a way around it. I think that there is some sort of middle ground where, the psychological realm is still extremely important, as well as the materialistic realm. We've said this from the beginning here on the podcast and the YouTube channel. Our physical realm is very, very important. It's nothing to be negated. I think that's one of the biggest problems with this whole pseudo-spiritual movement, that, everything's amaterial. Again, not to, to put down the importance of that, but just to say that we still need to take care of ourselves physically. There's a reason why all the religious texts talk about treating your body as a temple as well, right? That's even beyond religious texts. This is something that's been spoken over for a long time. You need to take care of your vessel, your physical vessel, so I hope this clears some things up, and I hope I asked some decent questions to consider, and looking forward to hear you guys' thoughts. Make sure to subscribe. We're going to give a book away at 2,500. But he still hasn't claimed the book, so it might have to go to another person. So make sure you subscribe, because we still got that one to give away. Make sure you like and comment as well. I really am eager to read your guys' comments on this. This topic is so fascinating. I think that there is an interesting interplay here, and I'm really excited to learn more about it and really refine the arguments surrounding this topic. So thank you guys for listening. Really appreciate you all. Thanks for listening, guys. Take care.